July 5, 1943. Lieutenant Hans von Luck sat in the commander's cupola of his Panzer IV tank, watching the eastern horizon lighten with approaching dawn. Around him, hundreds of German tanks stretched across the Russian steppe, in formation preparing for the largest armored offensive in military history. The rumble of engines was deafening. Exhaust fumes mixed with morning mist created a haze across the landscape. Von Luck had fought in France, North Africa, and Russia. He had seen mechanized warfare at its most brutal, but nothing compared to what was about to begin. Operation Citadel, the German offensive to eliminate the Soviet salient around Kursk, would commit over 6,000 tanks to battle across a front hundreds of kilometers wide. The clash would determine the future of the war on the Eastern Front, and would mark the last time Germany could launch a major strategic offensive against the Soviet Union. The Battle of Kursk would become the greatest tank battle in history. The Kursk salient had formed during winter fighting in early 1943. After the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad in February, Soviet forces had pushed westward, recapturing territory. However, German counterattacks in March stabilized the front, creating a large Soviet-held bulge centered on the city of Kursk. The salient extended approximately 200 kilometers north to south and 120 kilometers east to west at its deepest. German forces held the shoulders of the salient north and south. The obvious military solution was to attack from both shoulders simultaneously, cut off the salient, and trap Soviet forces inside. This would eliminate a Soviet advantage position and might allow Germany to regain initiative on the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein proposed Operation Citadel to eliminate the Kursk salient. The plan called for two massive panzer thrusts. Army Group South under Manstein would attack northward from the Belgorod area. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge would attack southward from the Oral area. The two thrusts would meet east of Kursk, encircling Soviet forces. The operation would employ Germany's newest and most powerful tanks, including the Tiger I with its 88mm gun and the new Panther medium tank. Success would trap hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and restore German prestige after Stalingrad. Failure might mean Germany could never again mount strategic offensive in the East. Adolf Hitler initially approved Citadel for May, but repeatedly delayed the operation. Hitler wanted to wait for more Panthers to be delivered and for improvements to tank production. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare defenses. German commanders argued strenuously that delay was fatal. The element of surprise was lost. Soviet intelligence had discovered German plans. The Red Army was fortifying the salient with unprecedented depth. However, Hitler insisted on waiting until Germany had overwhelming tank superiority. The attack was finally scheduled for early July. By then, the Soviets had created the most formidable defensive system ever built. Soviet intelligence learned of German intentions through multiple sources. The Lucy spy ring in Switzerland provided detailed information about German planning. Soviet partisans behind German lines reported tank concentrations. British intelligence shared ultra-decrypts of German communications. Most importantly, Soviet intelligence officer Rudolf Rössler provided precise details of German order of battle and attack dates. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, coordinating Soviet defenses, knew exactly where and when the Germans would attack. Rather than preemptively striking German concentrations, Zhukov decided to allow the attack to proceed into prepared defenses that would bleed German armor strength before Soviet counteroffensive. The Soviet defensive preparation was extraordinary. The Red Army constructed 8 separate defensive belts across the salient with a total depth of nearly 200 kilometers. Each belt included anti-tank ditches, minefields, bunkers, artillery positions, and tank traps. Engineers laid over 1 million mines. Artillery was concentrated in unprecedented density, with over 20,000 guns positioned to create killing zones. tank brigades were positioned in depth as mobile reserves to counterattack any German penetration. The Voronezh Front under General Nikolai Vatutin defended the southern sector. The Central Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky defended the northern sector. Behind them, the Steppe Front under General Ivan Konev provided strategic reserve. Soviet forces in the salient numbered over 1.3 million soldiers, with over 3,300 tanks. German forces committed to Citadel included Army Group South, with 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, totaling approximately 350,000 soldiers and over 1,500 tanks. Army Group Center committed 9th Army, with approximately 330,000 soldiers and nearly 900 tanks. Additional reserves and supporting units brought total German strength to approximately 780,000 soldiers and nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns. The Germans concentrated their newest equipment at the spearheads. The Tiger Dampfihorn heavy tank with its powerful 88mm gun and heavy armor was nearly invincible in frontal engagement. The new Panther medium tank had excellent armor and a high-velocity 75mm gun. The Ferdinand tank destroyer carried the massive 88mm gun in a heavily armored chassis. Germany was betting everything on technological superiority. The German offensive began at 3:30 a.m. on July 5th with a massive artillery barrage. However, Soviet forces had launched their own preemptive artillery strike 30 minutes earlier, disrupting German assembly areas. The German attack jumped off slightly behind schedule, but with overwhelming force. In the south, 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth led the main attack with 3 Panzer Corps. The 2. SS Panzer Corps, with divisions Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, formed the armored spearhead with over 600 tanks, including Tigers and Panthers. The attack struck the 6th Guards Army positions, creating immediate crisis for Soviet defenders. The terrain favored defense. The steppe was not flat open ground, but gently rolling terrain crossed by numerous small rivers and ravines. Soviet engineers had positioned defenses to maximize these natural obstacles. Villages were fortified as strongpoints. Roads and bridges were mined. Open areas were covered by anti-tank gun positions. German tanks advancing across the steppe faced concentrated fire from multiple directions. Soviet PaK anti-tank guns firing from prepared positions engaged German armor at maximum range. Soviet T-34 tanks positioned hull down on reverse slopes ambushed advancing Germans. The Tiger tanks proved nearly immune to frontal hits from Soviet guns, but had vulnerabilities. The Tiger was mechanically unreliable with frequent breakdowns. Its weight caused problems crossing bridges and in soft ground. The complex transmission failed regularly. Most critically, the Tiger had thin armor on sides and rear. Soviet tactics evolved to allow Tigers to penetrate into killing zones where T-34s could attack flanks and rear. The new Panther tank had serious teething problems. Early production Panthers had engine fires and transmission failures. Many Panthers broke down before reaching combat. Those that did fight proved effective, but were too few to change the battle. The fighting in the southern sector was intense. 2. SS Panzer Corps advanced approximately 30 kilometers in 6 days of constant combat. However, this was far short of operational objectives. Soviet defenses absorbed the German attack. Every village required house-to-house fighting. Every hilltop required assault. Soviet defenders fought tenaciously, knowing that behind them were more defensive lines. The German advance was measured in hundreds of meters per day with horrific casualties. Tank losses mounted as German armor pushed through minefields and faced concentrated anti-tank fire. The dreaded 88mm gun that had dominated North Africa found itself facing prepared defenses with interlocking fields of fire. The northern attack by 9th Army under General Walter Model made even less progress. Model's forces attacked into the northern face of the salient against Central Front positions. The terrain was even less favorable with marshy ground and forests. Soviet defenses were particularly deep on this axis. Model committed his armor, including Tiger companies from the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion. Despite Tigers leading the assault, 9th Army advanced barely 12 kilometers in 6 days. The attack bogged down in the 2nd Defensive Belt. Model's forces suffered heavy tank losses to mines and anti-tank guns. By July 10th, Model concluded that breakthrough was impossible and recommended halting the offensive. The climax of the southern battle occurred on July 12th at Prokhorovka. This engagement has become legendary as the greatest tank battle in history, though the reality is complex. German Besatzungsführung. SS Panzer Corps approached Prokhorovka with the intention of continuing the advance eastward. Soviet High Command ordered 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov to counterattack and stop the German advance. On the morning of July 12th, approximately 800 Soviet tanks attacked German positions near Prokhorovka. The ensuing battle involved over 1,500 tanks in close-range combat across rolling steppe. The Prokhorovka engagement did not unfold as Soviet planners intended. Rotmistrov's T-34s attacked across open ground toward prepared German positions. The newer T-34 Model 76 had an excellent 76mm gun and sloped armor, but German tank guns outranged it. Tigers and Panthers engaged Soviet tanks at distances where Soviet guns could not penetrate German armor. T-34s had to close to point-blank range to have effect. Many Soviet tanks were destroyed before reaching effective range. However, Soviet numbers and determination forced Germans into close combat, where individual technical superiority mattered less. The fighting at Prokhorovka was chaotic and brutal. Tanks fought at ranges measured in tens of meters. Crews that survived destroyed tanks, abandoned vehicles, and fought with small arms. The battlefield became covered with burning wrecks. Thick smoke obscured visibility. Tank commanders navigated by dead reckoning, trying to locate enemy positions while avoiding friendly fire. The combat continued throughout July 12th, with neither side achieving decisive advantage. Soviet losses were severe with several hundred tanks destroyed. German losses were smaller in absolute numbers, but represented higher percentage of available strength. Most critically, the German advance was stopped. 2nd SS Panzer Corps could not continue eastward as planned. Adolf Hitler summoned his commanders to a conference on July 13th. The situation had changed dramatically. On July 10th, Allied forces had landed in Sicily, beginning the invasion of Italy. Italian resistance was collapsing. Hitler needed to transfer forces from Russia to Italy to prevent Italian surrender and Allied advance. Additionally, Soviet forces had launched major offensives against German positions at Orel, north of the Kursk salient. These attacks threatened to cut off German forces if Citadel continued. Hitler made the decision to halt Operation Citadel. The offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. German forces would withdraw and redeploy. The decision was controversial among German commanders who believed breakthrough was still possible. However, Hitler's strategic judgment was correct. Germany could not afford to continue Citadel while Italy collapsed and Soviet forces threatened encirclement. The halting of Citadel marked a strategic turning point. Germany had committed its best forces and newest equipment to eliminating the Kursk salient. The offensive had failed. Germany would never again mount a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From July 1943 onward, German forces would be on defensive as Soviet offensives pushed westward. The psychological impact was enormous. German soldiers who had believed in ultimate victory now faced the reality that the war in the East was lost. Soviet forces gained confidence that they could defeat German armor in open battle. The industrial balance had shifted decisively in Soviet favor, with Soviet tank production far exceeding German output. Soviet counteroffensives began while German forces were still engaged at Kursk. Operation Kutuzov attacked German positions at Orel, north of the salient beginning July 12. Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev attacked toward Belgorod and Kharkov in the south, beginning August 3. These offensives caught German forces off balance while they were withdrawing from the Kursk battle. Soviet commanders Zhukov and Vasilevsky coordinated massive armor and infantry attacks supported by overwhelming artillery. German forces conducted fighting withdrawals but could not hold positions. By August 23, Soviet forces had recaptured Kharkov. The Kursk salient was eliminated not by German offensive, but by Soviet counteroffensive that pushed German forces far to the west. The casualties at Kursk were enormous, though precise figures remain debated. German records indicate approximately 54,000 casualties, including killed and wounded, during Citadel itself. Soviet casualties during the defensive phase were approximately 178,000. However, the subsequent Soviet counteroffensives caused far higher losses for both sides. When including the counteroffensives, Soviet casualties reached approximately 863,000, while German casualties were approximately 200,000. Tank losses were particularly severe. Germany lost approximately 760 tanks and assault guns during Citadel. Many more were lost during the counteroffensives. Soviet tank losses exceeded 1,800, but Soviet production replaced them quickly, while German industry could not match Soviet output. The tank warfare at Kursk demonstrated evolution of armored combat. The German blitzkrieg tactics that had dominated 1940 and 1941 faced prepared defenses in depth. Soviet commanders had learned from earlier defeats. Rather than meeting German armor in open battle where German tactical skill and technical superiority could dominate, Soviet forces fought from prepared positions, forcing Germans to attack into killing zones. The concept of defense in depth with multiple belts proved extremely effective. German penetrations into the first defensive belt found another belt behind it and another behind that. The attacking force exhausted itself, breaking through successive lines while reserves counterattacked penetrations. The Tiger tank's performance at Kursk was mixed. The Tiger's 88mm gun and heavy frontal armor made it nearly invincible in direct engagement. Soviet tank guns could not penetrate Tiger frontal armor at normal combat ranges. However, Tigers had critical weaknesses. Mechanical reliability was poor with frequent breakdowns. The complex transmission and engine required constant maintenance. In the muddy and dusty conditions of the Russian steppe, Tigers broke down regularly. Additionally, the Tiger's side and rear armor were vulnerable. Soviet tactics evolved to allow Tigers to advance, while T-34s attacked from flanks and rear. Soviet infantry with anti-tank rifles and magnetic mines targeted track and engine compartments. The Tiger was a formidable weapon, but not decisive. The Panther tank's debut at Kursk was disappointing. The Panther had excellent armor and firepower with a high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate Soviet armor at long range. However, early production Panthers suffered numerous technical problems. Engine fires were common due to fuel line issues. Transmissions failed under combat stress. Many Panthers broke down before reaching battle. Those that functioned proved effective, but were too few to influence the outcome. After Kursk, German industry addressed the technical problems, and later production Panthers became one of the war's best tanks. However, at Kursk, the Panther was not ready for combat. The Ferdinand tank destroyer saw action at Kursk with mixed results. The Ferdinand mounted the massive 88mm gun in a heavily armored casemate. It could destroy any Soviet tank at extreme range. However, the Ferdinand had no defensive machine guns and was vulnerable to Soviet infantry with explosives and Molotov cocktails. Soviet infantry learned to attack Ferdinands in close combat, where the vehicle could not defend itself. Additionally, the Ferdinand's weight caused frequent mechanical problems. Many Ferdinands broke down or became stuck in muddy ground. The Ferdinand was redesigned after Kursk, with addition of hull machine gun and improved reliability. Soviet armor tactics showed significant improvement at Kursk compared to earlier battles. In 1941 and 1942, Soviet tank attacks had often been poorly coordinated charges across open ground, resulting in massive losses. By 1943, Soviet commanders used terrain more effectively, positioning tanks in ambush positions and fighting from prepared defenses. The counterattacks at Prokhorovka, though costly, demonstrated willingness to accept losses to achieve strategic objectives. Soviet doctrine emphasized mass and momentum rather than preservation of equipment. The Red Army could afford high tank losses because Soviet industry produced thousands of T-34s monthly. Germany could not replace losses at similar rate. The T-34 medium tank remained the backbone of Soviet armor at Kursk. The T-34 Model 1942 and the improved Model 43 with better turret and gun were reliable, mobile, and adequately armed. The sloped armor provided good protection. The wide tracks performed well in mud and snow. The diesel engine was reliable and less flammable than gasoline. While German Tigers and Panthers had technical advantages in armor and firepower, the T-34 was available in vast numbers and could be produced quickly by semi-skilled workers. Soviet industry built over 35,000 T-34s during the war, compared to less than 2,000 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers. Quantity became its own quality when Soviet tank factories outproduced German factories by ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. The infantry fighting at Kursk was as intense as the tank combat. German infantry had to clear Soviet defensive positions village by village. Soviet defenders fought from bunkers and trenches, often fighting to the last man. German infantry casualties were severe, particularly in assault engineer units that had to clear bunkers and breach fortifications. Soviet infantry defending the lines knew that every hour they held delayed the German advance, allowing reserves to move into position. The Red Army at Kursk demonstrated the tenacity and toughness that would characterize Soviet infantry throughout the war. German soldiers who had dismissed Soviet troops as poorly trained and poorly led learned that defensive fighting on prepared ground with adequate weapons made the Red Army a formidable opponent. The artillery battle at Kursk was extraordinary. Soviet artillery doctrine emphasized mass and concentration. Soviet forces positioned over 20,000 guns and mortars in the Kursk salient. When German attacks developed, Soviet artillery commanders directed devastating fire on German assembly areas and approach routes. The multiple rocket launcher systems, known as Katyushas, created terrifying bombardments that disrupted German attacks. German artillery responded with counter-battery fire, but could not suppress the vast Soviet artillery park. The artillery duel created a hellish landscape of craters and destroyed equipment, where infantry and tanks had to advance under constant shell fire. The air battle over Kursk was intense, with both Luftwaffe and Soviet Air Force committing thousands of aircraft. The Luftwaffe attempted to provide close air support for advancing ground forces and to attack Soviet armor concentrations. Soviet fighters contested German air superiority, forcing aerial battles across the entire front. The Luftwaffe had quality advantages with experienced pilots and good aircraft, including Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters and Stuka dive bombers. However, Soviet numerical superiority and improving pilot quality made the air battle more equal than in previous years. Soviet Sturmovik ground attack aircraft attacked German armor columns, inflicting significant losses. Neither side achieved air superiority, allowing both ground forces to operate, but under constant air threat. The German withdrawal after Citadel's cancellation was conducted professionally, preventing Soviet forces from achieving complete encirclement. However, the psychological impact on German troops was severe. Soldiers who had advanced expecting breakthrough found themselves retreating, having failed to achieve objectives despite heavy casualties. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded German armor was broken. Conversely, Soviet morale soared. The Red Army had stopped the strongest German offensive and then pushed German forces back. Soviet soldiers gained confidence that victory was achievable. This psychological shift was as important as the tactical outcome. The logistical aspects of Kursk demonstrated Soviet organizational improvement. Supporting over 1 million Soviet soldiers and thousands of tanks required massive supply efforts. Soviet railways and trucks moved millions of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and replacement equipment to the front. The Soviet logistics system, though less sophisticated than German equivalents, proved adequate to sustain operations. German logistics struggled to maintain advancing forces, especially as Soviet partisans disrupted supply lines. The partisan war behind German lines became increasingly effective in 1943, with large-scale attacks on railways and supply depots coordinated with Red Army offensives. The role of Soviet intelligence and espionage in the Kursk victory cannot be overstated. The Lucy spy ring provided detailed intelligence, allowing Soviet commanders to know German plans months in advance. This intelligence enabled the construction of elaborate defenses exactly where needed. Soviet commanders positioned forces optimally to meet German attacks. When German commanders complained after the battle that Soviet defenses were positioned with perfect knowledge of German plans, they were correct. The intelligence war was won decisively by the Soviets, allowing them to prepare the defensive system that stopped Citadel. The international impact of Kursk was significant. The battle occurred simultaneously with Allied landings in Sicily and Italian negotiations for surrender. Germany faced strategic crisis on multiple fronts, with insufficient forces to address all threats. Hitler's decision to halt Citadel and transfer forces to Italy weakened the Eastern Front, allowing Soviet advances. The Western Allies noted Soviet success at Kursk, recognizing that the Red Army was capable of defeating German forces without Western ground intervention in France. This knowledge influenced Allied strategic planning regarding the timing of the cross-channel invasion. The German commanders involved in Kursk had mixed opinions about the operation. Field Marshal von Manstein believed his forces were on the verge of breakthrough when Hitler canceled the offensive. Manstein argued that another few days would have achieved decisive success. General Guderian opposed Citadel from the beginning, arguing that the delays had given Soviets too much time to prepare. General Model recognized during the northern attack that breakthrough was impossible and recommended cancellation. The debate continued among German officers after the war, with some arguing Citadel could have succeeded if executed earlier, while others maintained the operation was misconceived from the start. Soviet commanders were pleased with the outcome, but recognized the high cost. Zhukov's defensive strategy had worked, forcing Germans to attack prepared positions. However, Soviet tank losses were severe, particularly at Prokhorovka, where Rotmistrov's counterattack resulted in heavy casualties. Soviet doctrine accepted high losses to achieve objectives, but the scale of losses required careful management of reserves. The subsequent counteroffensives succeeded in large part because Soviet industry could replace losses while German industry could not. The tank technology race continued after Kursk. Germany developed increasingly powerful tanks, including the Tiger II heavy tank, and various tank destroyer variants. Soviet industry improved the T-34 and developed the IS-2 heavy tank with powerful 122mm gun. However, the fundamental equation remained unchanged. Soviet industry produced far more tanks than German industry. Soviet forces could sustain losses and continue offensive operations. German forces fought defensive battles, trying to preserve scarce equipment. By 1944, German panzer divisions were shadows of their former strength, while Soviet tank armies numbered thousands of vehicles. The memory of Kursk in Soviet and Russian historical consciousness is significant. The battle is remembered as the greatest tank battle in history and as evidence of Soviet military capability. The victory demonstrated that the Red Army could defeat German forces in conventional battle. Kursk became part of the narrative of the Great Patriotic War celebrating Soviet resistance and eventual victory. The tank crews and soldiers who fought at Kursk were honored as heroes who stopped the last major German offensive. German memory of Kursk is more ambiguous. The battle represents the final German attempt at strategic offensive in the east. After Kursk, German forces fought defensively for 2 years until final defeat. For German veterans, Kursk demonstrated the futility of continuing the war against overwhelming Soviet resources. The technical superiority of German tanks proved insufficient against Soviet numbers and defensive preparation. Some German accounts portray Kursk as a near success cancelled prematurely by Hitler's strategic mistakes. Others recognize that Citadel was doomed from the start, given Soviet foreknowledge and defensive preparations. The Battle of Kursk remains studied in military academies worldwide as example of defensive operations and armored warfare. The Soviet defensive system demonstrated the effectiveness of defense in depth, with multiple belts that absorbed attacking forces. The coordination of intelligence, defensive positions, reserves, and counteroffensives showed sophisticated operational planning. For armor forces, Kursk illustrated the importance of combined arms coordination. Tanks unsupported by infantry and artillery proved vulnerable. The most advanced tanks could be defeated by proper defensive tactics and sufficient numbers of anti-tank weapons. The historical debate about Kursk continues among scholars. Some historians emphasize the decisive nature of the battle, arguing it marked the definitive turning point on the Eastern Front. Others note that German offensive capability had already been broken at Stalingrad, and Kursk merely confirmed existing trends. The casualty figures remained disputed, with Soviet and Russian sources often minimizing Soviet losses while emphasizing German casualties. German sources sometimes exaggerate Soviet losses while minimizing their own. Modern historians, using archival records from both sides, have established more accurate figures, though debates continue about the totals. The legacy of Kursk extends beyond the immediate military outcome. The battle demonstrated that German military superiority was not inevitable. Soviet forces, using adequate equipment and competent tactics, could defeat German attacks. The industrial balance had shifted decisively, with Soviet production exceeding German output across all categories. Most importantly, Kursk showed that Germany could not win the war in the East. From July 1943 onward, the question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but when and at what cost. The Battle of Kursk answered those questions, showing that Soviet forces would advance westward regardless of German resistance, and that the price would be measured in millions of casualties on both sides. The individual experiences of soldiers at Kursk illuminate the human dimension of the battle. German tank commander Lieutenant Otto Carius commanded Tiger tanks at Kursk, and later wrote memoirs describing the combat. Carius noted that Tigers were nearly invincible from the front, but required careful tactics to protect vulnerable sides and rear. His unit learned to position Tigers hull down using terrain while supporting Panthers and Panzer IV's covered flanks. Despite tactical successes destroying numerous Soviet tanks, Carius recognized that German forces were being ground down by sheer Soviet numbers. Each day brought more Soviet tanks, even as German losses could not be replaced. Soviet tank commander Lieutenant Alexander Fadin commanded a T-34 at Prokhorovka. His account describes the terror of advancing across open ground toward German positions with shells exploding around his tank. Fadin's tank was hit twice, but armor held, allowing him to close range and engage a German Panzer IV that he destroyed. His tank then took a hit that penetrated, killing the driver and gunner. Fadin and the loader escaped the burning tank. Fadin was wounded, but survived. He returned to combat 2 months later in a new T-34 and fought through to Berlin in 1945. His story was typical of thousands of Soviet tank crews who experienced the horror of armored combat and continued fighting despite losses. The maintenance and logistics challenges at Kursk were immense for both sides. German maintenance crews worked continuously to repair damaged tanks and return them to combat. The Tiger tank required particularly intensive maintenance, with engine and transmission repairs needed frequently. Spare parts were scarce, forcing mechanics to cannibalize destroyed tanks for components. Fuel supply was critical, with German armor consuming vast quantities. Soviet partisans attacked fuel convoys, reducing available supplies. By the battle's end, some German panzer divisions had more tanks in repair shops than in combat. Soviet maintenance operations were simpler, due to T-34 design, but operated on larger scale. Soviet tank factories designed the T-34 for rapid repair with easily replaceable components. Battlefield recovery teams pulled damaged tanks back to repair areas where crews replaced engines, transmissions, and turrets as complete units rather than repairing individual components. This approach was less elegant than German maintenance, but allowed faster return to combat. Soviet logistics benefited from shorter supply lines and rail networks that remained under Soviet control. The ability to sustain operations while maintaining and replacing equipment proved decisive. The command and control systems of both sides faced severe tests at Kursk. German commanders used radio communications effectively, coordinating armor and infantry attacks. However, Soviet defensive fire often destroyed radio antennas, forcing German units to use runners and signal flags. This slowed decision-making and reduced coordination. Soviet command initially struggled with the scale of operations. Radio communications were less reliable than German systems. However, Soviet commanders compensated with detailed pre-battle planning and clear objectives that allowed subordinate commanders to execute without constant guidance. The weather during the Kursk battle influenced operations significantly. Early July brought dry conditions, allowing armor to maneuver across the steppe. However, thunderstorms on several days turned ground muddy, reducing mobility. Dust from thousands of vehicles created visibility problems, particularly for advancing Germans who drove into dust clouds raised by lead elements. The heat was intense, with temperatures exceeding 30 degrees Celsius. Tank crews suffered in the closed metal boxes, with temperatures inside reaching 50 degrees or higher. Soldiers on both sides struggled with heat exhaustion while engaging in intense physical combat. The German failure at Kursk had strategic consequences beyond the immediate battlefield. Hitler's credibility with senior commanders eroded. Generals who had opposed Citadel felt vindicated. Those who had supported the operation questioned Hitler's interference in military operations. The relationship between Hitler and the German General Staff never recovered. Increasing strategic disagreements led to dismissals of competent commanders and their replacement with yes-men who would not challenge Hitler's decisions. This damaged German military effectiveness in subsequent campaigns. The Soviet success reinforced Stalin's confidence in his commanders. Zhukov and Vasilevsky had planned and executed defensive operations that stopped the German offensive, then followed with counteroffensives that liberated significant territory. Stalin gave these commanders increasing authority to plan and execute operations. While Stalin maintained ultimate control and sometimes interfered in operational decisions, he generally allowed successful commanders freedom to operate. This stood in contrast to German's situation, where Hitler increasingly micromanaged tactical decisions with disastrous results. The propaganda value of Kursk was exploited by both sides. Soviet media portrayed the battle as evidence of Red Army superiority and inevitable German defeat. Newspapers and radio broadcasts celebrated the tank crews and infantry who had stopped German armor. The victory boosted Soviet civilian morale, showing that sacrifice and industrial effort were producing results. German propaganda attempted to portray Citadel as limited success, arguing that German forces had inflicted severe casualties and withdrew voluntarily for strategic reasons. However, German civilians increasingly doubted official pronouncements as reality of military setbacks became undeniable. The Eastern Front, after Kursk, saw continuous Soviet offensives pushing German forces westward. The Red Army liberated Ukraine in autumn 1943 and winter 1944. By spring 1944, Soviet forces approached pre-war borders. The summer offensive of 1944 destroyed Army Group Center in Operation Bagration, liberating Belarus. By autumn 1944, Soviet forces occupied Romania and Bulgaria and approached Germany itself. The continuous offensive was possible because Soviet industry replaced losses while German industry could not. Kursk marked the beginning of this inexorable advance. The tank designs developed during and after Kursk reflected lessons learned. Germany developed the Tiger II heavy tank with even thicker armor and more powerful gun. The Jagdpanther tank destroyer combined Panther chassis with powerful gun in low-profile casemate. However, these vehicles were produced in small numbers and suffered reliability problems. Soviet industry improved the T-34 with larger turret and better gun, creating the T-34-85 variant. The IS-2 heavy tank with 122 mm gun provided breakthrough capability. More importantly, Soviet industry produced these vehicles in vast numbers, ensuring numerical superiority on every sector of the front. The medical services on both sides faced overwhelming challenges at Kursk. German medical units treated thousands of wounded soldiers, many with severe burns from tank fires or blast injuries from artillery. Medical supplies were adequate, but evacuation of wounded was difficult under Soviet artillery fire. Soviet medical services handled even larger numbers of wounded with less sophisticated equipment. Soviet field hospitals used simple but effective triage, sending lightly wounded back to combat quickly while evacuating serious cases to rear hospitals. Soviet medicine emphasized speed of treatment and return to duty rather than long-term care. Both sides used frontline medics who treated wounded under fire, saving countless lives. The role of engineers at Kursk was critical. German pioneer units cleared Soviet minefields under fire to open paths for armor. This was extraordinarily dangerous work with high casualties. Soviet engineers laid minefields and constructed fortifications, creating the defensive belts that stopped German advances. Soviet engineers also conducted demolitions, destroying bridges and cratering roads to slow German advances. The engineers on both sides performed essential but underappreciated roles that significantly influenced battle outcomes. The anti-tank warfare at Kursk saw evolution of weapons and tactics. Soviet anti-tank rifles, though obsolete against heavy German armor, remained effective against lighter vehicles and could damage tracks and optics on heavy tanks. The ZIS-3 76 mm divisional gun served in anti-tank role, achieving numerous successes. Soviet anti-tank doctrine emphasized ambush tactics with guns positioned in depth, allowing German tanks to advance into killing zones where multiple guns engaged simultaneously. German anti-tank guns, including captured Soviet weapons, were used defensively as Soviet counteroffensives began. The role of Soviet Guards units at Kursk deserves emphasis. Guards designation indicated elite status, and units that received this title had distinguished themselves in previous battles. Multiple Guards armies, including 1st Guards Tank Army and 5th Guards Tank Army, participated at Kursk. Guards units received better equipment and priority for replacements. They were expected to accomplish difficult missions and generally succeeded. The Guards tradition connected to Imperial Russian elite units, creating continuity with pre-Soviet military history that Stalin encouraged to build morale and unit pride. The German SS Panzer divisions at Kursk represented elite formations, but with complicated legacy. Divisions like Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf were combat effective with experienced soldiers and good equipment. However, these units had committed atrocities on the Eastern Front, including executing prisoners and civilians. The SS units fought tenaciously at Kursk, achieving initial penetrations but could not overcome Soviet defenses. After Kursk, SS Panzer divisions continued fighting on both eastern and western fronts, remaining formidable opponents until the war's end. Their military effectiveness cannot be separated from their criminal conduct in other operations. The Soviet partisan movement coordinated operations with the Kursk battle, disrupting German supply lines. Large partisan formations conducted raids on railways, destroying trains carrying ammunition and fuel. German forces had to divert significant strength to guard supply lines, reducing combat power at the front. The partisan war tied down German security divisions that could have reinforced frontline units. Soviet High Command coordinated partisan operations with military offensives, creating strategic synergy that German forces could not counter effectively. The comparison between Kursk and earlier Eastern Front battles shows Soviet military evolution. At Moscow in 1941, Soviet forces stopped German advance through desperate defense and winter counteroffensive, but suffered enormous casualties. At Stalingrad in 1942 and 43, Soviet forces won through encirclement and grinding urban combat. At Kursk in 1943, Soviet forces deliberately allowed German attack into prepared defenses, then counterattacked systematically. This demonstrated sophisticated operational planning and improved capability. By 1944, Soviet operations showed mastery of combined arms warfare, coordinating armor, infantry, artillery, and air power in complex multi-front offensives. The impact of Allied strategic bombing on German war production influenced Kursk indirectly. Allied bombing of German industry disrupted tank production and fuel refineries. Luftwaffe fighters had to be withdrawn from Eastern Front to defend Germany, reducing German air support at Kursk. The need to defend against Allied bombing forced Germany to disperse industry and complicate supply chains. While Allied bombing did not stop German production, it reduced output and diverted resources that Germany needed on Eastern Front. The civilian experience in the Kursk region during the battle was horrific. Villages in combat zone were destroyed by shelling and fighting. Civilians unable to evacuate hid in cellars enduring bombardment. Many were caught in crossfire or targeted by retreating German forces. Soviet partisan activity brought German reprisals against suspected partisan sympathizers. The devastation of the region required years of reconstruction after the war. The Soviet government eventually rebuilt destroyed cities and villages, though scars remained for decades. The historical assessment of Kursk evolved over time. Immediate post-war Soviet histories portrayed the battle as brilliant Soviet victory with minimal acknowledgement of high casualties or tactical mistakes. Khrushchev-era histories began admitting Soviet losses while emphasizing German defeats. Post-Soviet Russian historians have access to archival records, allowing more balanced assessment. German histories initially portrayed Kursk as near success, cancelled by Hitler's mistakes. Later, German historians recognized that Citadel was poorly conceived and that Soviet defensive preparations made breakthrough impossible. Modern historians, using records from both sides, generally agree that Kursk marked definitive shift in Eastern Front balance, with Germany losing strategic initiative permanently. The Battle of Kursk stands as testament to industrial warfare's brutal arithmetic. Superior tactics and technology matter less than production capacity and willingness to accept casualties when industrial outputs differ by orders of magnitude. Germany produced excellent tanks, but could not produce enough to replace losses. Soviet Union produced adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers. This fundamental equation determined the war's outcome on Eastern Front. Kursk demonstrated this reality in stark terms, with 6,000 tanks clashing across Russian steppe, and Soviet industry proving capable of sustaining operations while German industry could not.